Right now, somewhere on Earth, a hammer with a yellow handle is swinging. A tape measure is snapping back into its case. A utility knife is scoring a line through drywall. A cordless drill is driving a screw into a stud. In the time it takes you to read this sentence, another one of these tools has been sold somewhere on the planet, on a job site in Texas, in a hardware store in Manila, in a garage in Warsaw. Stanley Black Decker sells tools in over 175 countries, employs roughly 48,000 people, and pulls in more than $15 billion a year. It is, by almost any measure, the largest tool company that has ever existed. Its yellow and black colors are printed on tape measures in Brazilian hardware stores, on drill cases in Australian warehouses, on wrenches sitting in toolboxes in the back of pickup trucks from Ohio to Osaka. There is a very good chance that somewhere within arm's reach of you right now, a junk drawer, a garage shelf, a toolbox under a sink, there is a tool carrying that name. Now picture the opposite. Picture one small wooden shed on the edge of a half-frozen Connecticut river town in 1843. Inside it, a 41-year-old man who has already failed at 2 businesses is hammering wrought iron bolts by hand, alone, with nobody watching and nobody caring. He has no factory. No investors banging down his door, no brand, just a hand-cranked forge, a stack of raw iron rods, and a stubborn refusal to admit that he might be exactly the kind of man who wasn't built for business. His name was Frederick Trent Stanley, and the space between that freezing shed and the empire that exists today isn't a straight line of genius. It's a mess of bankruptcies, a company that lost money in its own first year, a founder who quietly walked away from the business that bears his name, and a series of near-accidental decisions that somehow, against every reasonable expectation, built the biggest tool company on the planet. Frederick Stanley was not supposed to be a titan of American industry. He was born in 1802 in New Britain, Connecticut, one of 7 children in a farming family that measured success in acres, not iron. There was no engineering dynasty behind him, no wealthy patron, no formal training in metalworking. As a young man, he drifted the way a lot of restless 19th-century Americans drifted. He worked as a clerk on a Connecticut River steamboat, hauling freight and dealing with merchants up and down the water. Then he became something even less glamorous, an itinerant peddler working the American South, walking from town to town trying to sell whatever he could carry. This was not the resume of a future industrialist. This was the resume of a man still looking for something that would stick. In 1831, at 29 years old, Stanley finally tried to build something of his own. Along with his younger brother William, he opened a small operation in New Britain making house trimmings and door locks, practical, unglamorous hardware for a country that was building houses faster than it could furnish them. For a few years, it looked like it might work. Then, in 1837, the United States economy collapsed into one of the worst financial panics in its history. It started with cotton prices crashing and British banks tightening credit, and within months, it had metastasized into a full-blown collapse of the American banking system. Hundreds of banks failed. Paper money became worthless overnight in some regions. Businesses that had spent decades building reputations vanished in weeks, and small operations like the Stanley Brothers lock shop, undercapitalized, dependent on local credit, with no cushion to absorb a shock, never stood a chance. Frederick Stanley's first real venture didn't survive it. He was 35 years old, twice a failed businessman by most people's definition, standing in the wreckage of the Panic of 1837 with nothing to show for 6 years of work, but the knowledge of exactly how hardware was made and exactly how a business could die. Most men would have taken that as a sign. Go back to the steamboat, go back to peddling, find something safer. Stanley did not. In 1843, with the country still climbing out of the wreckage of the Panic, he tried again, smaller this time, tighter, more careful. Alongside his brother, he opened Stanley's Bolt Manufactory, a modest operation forging wrought iron door bolts and handles for houses and chests. No grand vision, no talk of empire. Just bolts, hinges, and the simple, stubborn belief that if he built something people needed and built it well, someone would eventually pay him for it. This is the part of the story that almost never makes it into the highlight reel because it isn't dramatic. There was no single dazzling invention in 1843. There was no jaw-dropping public demonstration. There was a broke man in his 40s, forging metal by hand in a small New England mill town, trying not to fail a third time. New Britain, Connecticut, in the 1840s was already crowded with operations exactly like his, dozens of small backyard foundries and forges all competing for the same scraps of a local hardware market, all one bad winter away from closing their doors. Stanley's little bolt shop wasn't obviously destined to outlast them. It was just one more gambler at a table full of gamblers, betting that this time the iron would hold. Picture what New Britain actually looked like in the 1840s, because it matters. This wasn't a quiet farm town with one lonely forge. It was a small, cramped valley crowded with dozens of competing metal shops, all drawing water power from the same streams, all hammering out bolts, hinges, buttons, and buckles for the same shrinking pool of local buyers. Fires broke out constantly. Credit was tight. A bad batch of iron, a broken water wheel, a slow month of sales, any one of those things could bury a shop that size permanently, and most of them eventually did. Stanley's bolt operation had no special advantage over its neighbors. Same iron, same tools, same customers. The only thing separating his shed from the dozen others, just like it was whether he showed up the next morning and did it again. But something about that bolt business worked. It made enough money, consistently enough, that Stanley could see a path beyond survival. He began expanding into other kinds of hardware: hinges, hooks, chains, the unglamorous connective tissue of every home and workshop in industrializing America. 19th century New England was in the middle of a manufacturing explosion, and Connecticut in particular was becoming a hive of small precision industries. Clockmakers, gun makers, hardware manufacturers, the region was earning a reputation for a very specific skill, turning raw metal into thousands of identical, reliable, mass-produced parts. New Britain itself would eventually earn the nickname Hardware City because of how many companies like Stanley's set up shop within a few square miles of each other. This was the real, unglamorous engine behind Stanley's rise. Not a single brilliant idea, but a location, a moment, and a stubbornness that refused to quit after 2 failures. By 1852, Stanley's little bolt operation had grown enough that he and his brother, together with 5 local investors, applied for a state charter and incorporated a new company under a name that would eventually mean something to almost every homeowner and contractor on Earth: the Stanley Works. And then, almost immediately, it lost money. The newly incorporated Stanley Works stumbled out of the gate, bleeding cash, in its very first year of existence. For a business that had just convinced 5 outside investors to put their money behind it, this was close to a death sentence. Investors do not tolerate losses quietly, and a company built on the reputation of a man who had already gone under once before did not have a lot of goodwill in reserve. Something had to change immediately, or the Stanley name would join the long list of failed New Britain foundries that history simply forgot. In 1854, Frederick Stanley made a decision that, in hindsight, might be the single most important moment in the entire history of the company, and it wasn't an engineering decision at all. He hired a 19-year-old. William H. Hart had no background in hardware manufacturing. He'd worked in the railroad industry as a freight agent and assistant station manager, a young man who understood logistics, distribution, and how to move goods efficiently across distances, but who had never forged a hinge in his life. Stanley made him a simple promise: perform well, and there would be a path to real responsibility. It was, on paper, a strange bet, an unproven teenager brought in to fix a struggling hardware company, but Hart moved fast. Within months of joining, he was promoted to secretary-treasurer. By 1856, before he'd even turned 21, he had won a seat on the company's board of directors. What Hart brought wasn't a better bolt. It was a better machine for selling bolts: smarter distribution, tighter cost control, sales agents placed in cities Stanley products had never reached, a relentless focus on getting Stanley hardware into the hands of buyers far beyond New Britain. He treated the company less like a workshop and more like a network, understanding, the way a former railroad man naturally would, that a product sitting unsold in a warehouse was worth nothing no matter how well it was made. While Frederick Stanley increasingly turned his attention toward New Britain's civic life, helping found the town's gaslight company, bringing the first running water system to the city, eventually becoming New Britain's first mayor in 1871, it was Hart, the railroad man with no metalworking pedigree, who quietly became the engine driving Stanley Works forward, year after year, for longer than most executives today spend in their entire careers. By the time Hart's remarkable 6-decade career at the company ended with his death in 1918, Stanley's annual sales had grown from a mere $7,000 to more than $11 million. The founder had built the forge. A 19-year-old outsider had built the machine that turned it into a company. Here's the twist almost nobody expects. Frederick Stanley, the man whose name is stamped on every yellow and black tool sold today, spent the last 2 decades of his life largely detached from the business itself. From the 1860s until his death in 1883, he devoted more of his energy to politics and civic projects than to hardware. He helped design New Britain's waterworks. He worked with the legendary landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted, the man behind Central Park, to plan Walnut Hill Park, a gift to the city he'd helped build. He served as the city's first mayor. He died in 1883, a respected local statesman, having never seen the company that carried his name become anything close to what it would eventually be. This is not the story of a visionary founder steering his empire from the top for 50 years. It's the story of a twice-failed businessman who built something solid enough that other people, a teenage railroad clerk, and later, an entirely separate company started by his own cousin, could turn it into something enormous. That second company is where the real technical breakthrough happened, and it didn't come from Frederick Stanley at all. In 1857, Stanley's cousin, Henry Stanley, founded a separate business a short distance away in the same town, the Stanley Rule and Level Company. On paper, this looked almost redundant, another hardware maker in the same small city with the same last name, making similar products. But Stanley Rule and Level found its own specialty: precision measuring tools, boxwood rules, squares and levels, the instruments a carpenter needed to make sure a cut was true and a wall was straight. And then it made a decision that would define hand tools for the next century. It acquired the rights to manufacture under the patents of a man named Leonard Bailey, whose design for an adjustable metal hand plane solved a problem carpenters had lived with for generations. Traditional wooden planes required a craftsman to physically remove and reshape the blade every time he needed a different depth of cut, slow, imprecise, and dependent entirely on the skill of the person doing it. Bailey's design let a carpenter adjust the blade's depth and angle with simple mechanical controls, turning a process that once demanded years of hand skill into something almost anyone could learn to do accurately in minutes. It sounds small. It wasn't. To understand why, you have to understand what a carpenter's life looked like before it. A wooden plane was, in a real sense, a single-purpose object. If you needed a slightly deeper cut, you didn't turn a dial, you pulled the blade, reshaped it, or swapped it out entirely, then reseated it by eye and by feel, hoping you'd guessed correctly. Skilled carpenters spent years learning to compensate for a tool that fought them at every adjustment. Bailey's design replaced all of that guesswork with a simple mechanical lever and a threaded adjustment knob at the back of the plane. Turn it one way, the blade advances. Turn it the other, it retreats. A brass lever off to the side let a carpenter correct the blade's lateral angle in seconds, keeping the cutting edge perfectly parallel to the wood. None of it required special strength or a master craftsman's decades of trained intuition, just a few turns of a knob and a glance down the length of the tool. It turned what had been an art into something closer to a repeatable, learnable skill, and that difference mattered enormously to a country in the middle of the largest building boom in its history. The Bailey plane became one of the most influential hand tool designs in American history, and Stanley Rule and Level's manufacture of it under license turned the company into the largest maker of planes and related tools in the entire country by the turn of the century. Two Stanleys, two companies. One built the foundation, the other built the innovation. Neither one, on its own, would have become the giant we recognize today. For decades, these two companies, the Stanley Works and Stanley Rule and Level, grew along parallel tracks in the same small Connecticut city, sometimes competing, sometimes complementing each other, never quite becoming one thing. Then, in 1920, that changed. The Stanley Works purchased Stanley Rule and Level outright, folding one of the most respected hand tool manufacturers in America directly into its own operations. The math alone tells you how significant this was. The acquisition brought roughly 1,200 additional workers into the company, increased its total capitalization by 50%, and added $6 million in net sales in a single stroke. Overnight, Stanley wasn't just a hardware company anymore. It was a hardware company and the largest plane manufacturer in the country, combined under a single roof, with a single brand, a single distribution network, and a product line that now covered nearly everything a builder, carpenter, or homeowner might need. This is the moment the Stanley, name most people recognize today, actually took shape, not at the company's founding in 1843, but 67 years later, through a merger nobody outside New Britain paid much attention to at the time. The celebration didn't last long. Less than a decade after absorbing Stanley Rule and Level, the newly enlarged Stanley Works walked straight into the Great Depression. Construction, the industry Stanley depended on more than any other, collapsed nationwide. Nobody was building new houses. Nobody was hiring carpenters. And a carpenter who isn't working doesn't need a new plane, a new hammer, or a new box of hinges. Orders dried up across the entire hardware and hand tool industry, and companies far larger than Stanley folded during the early 1930s. It would have been easy and understandable for a company that had just doubled its size through acquisition to buckle under the weight of a collapsing national economy. Stanley didn't disappear, but it also didn't pretend the depression wasn't happening. Production slowed, workforces shrank, and the company held on largely by leaning on the sheer breadth of the product line it had just assembled, spreading thin demand across dozens of categories instead of betting everything on one. It was survival, not triumph, and it set the stage for the next real leap forward, the moment America started building again. The 20th century did not hand Stanley its dominance on a silver platter, though. Growth came in fits and bursts, punctuated by moments that could have derailed the entire operation. During World War II, Stanley's plants were converted to support the war effort almost overnight. Machines that had spent decades stamping outdoor hinges and hand plane bodies were retooled to cut steel jackets for ammunition. The skilled male workforce that had run those machines for a generation was suddenly gone, drafted or enlisted, and the company turned to women who had never set foot on a factory floor to keep the lines running. Photographs from the period show them at the machines that once belonged to men twice their age, cutting precision steel components for a war being fought an ocean away. It was not a smooth or comfortable transition, and it demanded that a company built on generations of accumulated craft knowledge suddenly train an entirely new workforce, fast, with no room for error. When the war ended, Stanley faced the same challenge every American manufacturer faced, converting wartime production capacity back into consumer goods before competitors got there first, all while millions of returning soldiers re-entered a civilian workforce that didn't have room for everyone. It managed the transition, and then it did something that would become one of the most important strategic decisions in its history. It started marketing directly to ordinary people, not just professional tradesmen. In the 1920s, and continuing for decades afterward, Stanley ran advertising campaigns in popular magazines that pictured fathers and sons working together on do-it-yourself projects around the house, building a birdhouse, fixing a fence, tightening the hinges on a screen door. This wasn't just selling hammers. It was selling an identity, the idea that owning good tools and knowing how to use them was part of being a capable, responsible adult in modern America, that a well-stocked toolbox in the garage said something about the kind of husband, father, and homeowner you were. That single branding decision helped transform Stanley from a company that sold to hardware stores and contractors into a household name that sat in millions of American garages and basements, whether or not anyone in the house ever actually built a birdhouse. The setbacks kept coming, the way they always do in any company's real history. Economic downturns squeezed margins. Post-war competition from cheaper imports threatened to undercut American-made tools on price. In the 1950s, under CEO John C. Cairns, Stanley responded not by retreating, but by buying up smaller manufacturers like the Humason Manufacturing Company and the H.L. Judd Company, absorbing their capacity, their products, and their market share, growing not just through invention, but through consolidation. By 1957, Stanley had opened a massive new steel strapping plant in New Britain, nearly doubling its manufacturing capacity for that product line. And tucked into all of this expansion was one small, almost throwaway 1936 product introduction that would end up outliving nearly everything else the company ever made, the retractable blade utility knife. It was not flashy. It solved no dramatic engineering crisis the way the Bailey plane had. It was simply a thin steel handle, a sliding mechanism, and a razor-sharp replaceable blade. And it turned out to be so useful, so universally needed, that it would eventually end up in nearly every toolbox, kitchen drawer, and warehouse loading dock in America, essentially unchanged in its basic design for the better part of a century. By the middle of the 20th century, Stanley had built the largest hand tool manufacturing plant in the entire world, right there in the same small Connecticut city where Frederick Stanley had once forged bolts alone in a wooden shed. Then, in the final decades of the 20th century, Stanley faced a challenge that had nothing to do with iron, forges, or blade angles. The global economy itself was changing beneath its feet. Manufacturing was shifting overseas. Labor costs, currency exchange, and international supply chains were becoming as important to a tool company's survival as the quality of its steel. In 1989, the New York Times ran a story with a blunt headline, "The Stanley Works Goes Global." The company that had spent a century and a half rooted in one small American town was now restructuring itself for a world where tools needed to be made, priced, and sold on every continent simultaneously. A few years later, business reporters would ask, half joking and half serious, how you even say tape measure in Chinese, a question that would have meant nothing to Frederick Stanley, but meant everything to the executives now running his company. It was a wrenching transition. Factories closed. Others opened on the other side of the planet. Executives who had spent careers thinking in terms of New Britain now had to think in terms of Shanghai, Sao Paulo, and Mexico City. Not every part of that transition was comfortable, and not every American worker who had built the company's reputation over generations came along for the ride. But the alternative, standing still while the rest of the tool industry globalized around it, would have been fatal. Stanley chose to change, and it survived the choice. The final, decisive chapter in Stanley's rise to the very top of the tool industry came not through invention, but through one enormous act of consolidation. The same instinct that had driven the 1920 merger scaled up to a level Frederick Stanley could never have imagined. Across town from Stanley's Connecticut roots, an entirely different tool story had been unfolding since 1910, when two machinists in Baltimore, Maryland, S. Duncan Black and Alonzo Decker, founded a small manufacturing company of their own. In 1916 and 1917, that company, Black and Decker, patented and introduced the portable pistol grip electric drill, a design so intuitive and effective that it became the template for handheld power tools for the rest of the century. Where Stanley had built its empire on hand tools, hammers, planes, wrenches, the tools you swing and turn with your own muscle, Black & Decker built its reputation on electricity, on power tools that did the work your muscles used to have to do alone. For nearly a century, these were two separate American tool empires, competing in overlapping but distinct corners of the same industry. Then, in November 2009, both companies announced they were merging. It was not framed publicly as a takeover, and it wasn't one. Both boards approved it, both sets of shareholders voted on it, and the resulting company would carry both names forward rather than erasing one in favor of the other. The deal, completed in March 2010, created a combined company worth roughly $8.4 billion, bringing together Stanley's hand tools and hardware with Black & Decker's power tools and its own stable of legendary brands, DeWalt, Porter-Cable, Kwikset, Baldwin. The new company took the name Stanley Black & Decker, and Stanley shareholders retained just over half ownership of the combined entity, a fitting final detail for a company whose name had outlasted its founder by more than a century. The integration was not instant or painless, merging two enormous manufacturers with overlapping distribution networks, competing internal cultures, and thousands of employees on both sides meant years of restructuring, cost-cutting, and the kind of quiet internal friction that never makes it into a press release. But within a matter of quarters, the combined company was already reporting hundreds of millions of dollars in merger-related cost savings, and the hand tool and power tool divisions that had once been fierce rivals were now sitting inside the same quarterly earnings report. What followed was less a single dramatic climax and more a steady, compounding consolidation of dominance. In the years after the merger, Stanley Black Decker kept absorbing brands the way the original Stanley Works had absorbed Stanley Rule and Level back in 1920. The same pattern, the same instinct, just executed on a global, multi-billion-dollar scale. In 2017, the company acquired the Craftsman brand, one of the most recognizable tool names in American retail history, bringing yet another century of American tool-making heritage under the same corporate roof. By the mid-2020s, Stanley Black Decker employed roughly 48,000 people across more than 100 countries and pulled in more than $15 billion in annual revenue, numbers that would have been simply unimaginable to a man forging bolts by hand for local New Britain residents in 1843. The company that started as one broke man's third attempt at a business now supplies tools to construction sites, factories, and toolboxes on every inhabited continent on Earth. There's something almost poetic and a little bit sad buried underneath all of this growth. Frederick Stanley, the man whose surname sits on more toolboxes than perhaps any other name in human history, never got to see any of it. He died in 1883 believing, if he thought about it at all, that he'd built a modest, respectable New Britain hardware manufacturer and helped bring clean water and a public park to his hometown along the way. He had no idea his cousin's separate company down the road would one day be folded into his own. He had no idea that a 19-year-old former railroad clerk he'd taken a chance on would spend 6 decades quietly building the machine that made his name mean something far beyond Connecticut. He certainly had no idea that more than a century after his death, his name would merge with that of 2 Baltimore machinists he never met, to create a company selling tools to nearly every country on the planet. Frederick Stanley spent his final years walking the paths of Walnut Hill Park, the very park he'd commissioned, probably far more proud of the waterworks and the gaslights and the mayoralty than of a bolt shop he'd mostly handed off to other people. He simply built something solid enough, honest hardware, made well, sold fairly, that it could survive being handed off again and again to people who saw further than he ever needed to. That in its own quiet way might be the truest kind of legacy an industrialist can leave. Not a monument to his own genius, but a foundation stable enough that other people's genius could be built on top of it for the next 180 years. So the next time you pick up a hammer, unroll a tape measure, or reach for a utility knife on a job site anywhere in the world, there's a real chance you're holding a small piece of that story, a chain that runs from a failed peddler and a bankrupt lock shop, through a teenage railroad clerk's quiet ambition, through a cousin's separate gamble on a better hand plane, through 2 world wars, a global economic restructuring. And finally through a merger with 2 Baltimore machinists who built the first drill you could hold in one hand. None of it happened because one brilliant man saw the whole picture from the start. It happened because a small, stubborn hardware shop in a Connecticut town nobody outside New England had heard of refused to disappear, and kept refusing, decade after decade, through panics, wars, recessions, and a completely reordered global economy, until Stanley stopped being the name of one broke man's third attempt at a business, and became the name stamped on more tools than any company in the history of the world. The shed is still there, in a manner of speaking. It's just 3,000 miles wide now, and it never stops forging.